There is much in Mr. Richard Burton's recent plea for a healthful tone in American literature with which all candid and thoughtful critics will agree. It is quite true that the pseudo-realism preached by Zola and echoed by his imitators has ended, or is ending, in dismal failure. It is also quite true that the best and most vital literature cannot be produced in a period of decadence. But sweeping conclusions are as dangerous in criticism as anywhere else. I cannot help thinking that there is a gap in the logical process which makes the doctrine of art for art's sake responsible for the vagaries of Mr. Oscar Wilde and Mr. George Moore. I am inclined to believe that in some cases the badness of the art rather than the badness of the doctrine is at fault. It is not necessary to plunge too deeply into a discussion of the subtle relations between art and life in order to discern the fallacy of Mr. Burton's conclusion. One differs from so accomplished a critic with hesitation, but it is at least permissible to state the other side of the case as modestly as may be. The doctrine of art for art's sake is not inevitably promulgated solely by the spirit that denies. It is not inevitably a Mephistophelian cry, "Evil, be thou my good." On the other hand, a thoroughly healthy and sane art must find in itself its chief reward. The artist, if he be a conscientious artist, must paint life as he sees it. His failure, if he fails, is less likely to be due to a false theory than to arise from a distorted vision. Mr. Burton implies that distorted vision is the rule with those who hold to what they call an artistic point of view. They cannot see straight. They have no sense of perspective. Everything in their horizon assumes equal proportions. If this were true, nothing could be said in their defense. But is it true? It will perhaps be more useful to try to suggest some aspects of the question that Mr. Burton seems to have overlooked than to engage in any laborious compilation of evidence for the other side, more especially as no lover of literature can help agreeing, at least in part, with Mr. Burton on many points. I trust that I shall not do the essential part of his argument injustice if I sum it up by saying that, although he sees a brilliant opportunity for literature in the United States, he thinks that American writers, as a rule, fail to take full advantage of it. Largely because of the prevalence among them of the doctrine of art for art's sake, and the influences of spiritual unrest at the bottom of it, that the fallacy of the creed thus adopted is obvious, and that philosophy and aesthetics are alike opposed to the arguments in its favor. This is by no means a full statement of his position, but I think that it covers the ground sufficiently and fairly. In the first place, I feel that Mr. Burton has somewhat overstated the degree, not to say the kind, of stimulus to literary endeavor which American life offers. True, this life is varied and diverse. It is lived in a constantly shifting scene. It drives ahead under the highest pressure. It surges against 1,000 social and economic barriers. But these things tell against art rather than for it. The man who is on the ground, who is a part of the action, gets a very confused idea of the progress of the battle. The analogy is imperfect, but it is perhaps none the less illuminative. Art demands leisure and the ability to see life as a whole. It is not until the sharpness of the struggle for a life is a little abated that a nation has time for art. If our American literature, as a rule, revolves about an older civilization, there may be some better reason for it than the incapacity of our writers. There came out of the West not long ago a defiant, perhaps I should have said an exultant, protest against the crushing critical domination of the East. It was intimated that the breath of artistic life blew freely only on the prairies, and that one must be a simple child of nature, with a home in the setting sun, to produce literature truly patriotic. But I do not think that we want to make our art quite so provincial as that. Of course, criticism should deal as kindly as possible, even to the point of indulgence, with the artist who shows a sense of local color, although the color may be crudely put on. But the same ear can delight in a simple Scottish ballad and a masterpiece by Verdi, the same eye can find satisfaction in a Wouverman and a Rubens, and the same mind can appreciate Mr. Hamlin Garland and Mr. Henry James. There need be no new art and no new criticism to convince us of this. Yet it is in the main true enough that the problems of an older civilization have more intrinsic value as well as greater extrinsic attraction to the novelist and the poet than a newer civilization whose problems are hardly formulated. 50 years ago New York and Boston were perhaps not as well known to fiction as Chicago and Denver are today. But New York and Boston have produced some rich literary results within a half a century. It would be strange if as much could not be said of Chicago and Denver 50 years hence. A novel like The Golden House is answer enough to the charge that American writers do not appreciate the possibilities of American life. But Mr. Burton objects to specialization, the study of particular environments and local types, and I suppose there is no doubt that The Golden House would come under this characterization. He wants our novelists to set to work with broader national motives. I fear that in the case of most of them there would not be enough to go around if they spread themselves out too thin. The writer who tells well his own particular and local plot may at least console himself with the reflection that he has at least caught one phase of contemporary life which is likely to be of use to the historian or the romancer of the future. And, perhaps, only that historian or that romancer, dealing with the things of the past, can get the true perspective and interpret the broader motives. If a great national novel were possible, would it not almost of necessity hark back to times far enough behind to permit the historical estimate, which is truer than the contemporary estimate? It is not the difficulty of the task, however, according to Mr. Burton, which keeps American fiction provincial. Our writers, he assumes, are too much under the influence of the spirit that denies. They suffer from defective perceptions of morality. When they talk about art for art's sake, it is because they are dominated by spiritual unrest, and no longer have religious convictions and ethical ideals. I will not say that the complaint is wholly unfounded. But if it were wholly justified we should be, artistically speaking, in a very bad way. I fully sympathize with Mr. Burton in his dislike of the so-called decadents, the men who find life truly artistic only in the moral and spiritual slums. But it seems to me like begging the question to say that if a man holds the art for art's sake theory he is necessarily a decadent. No, not the theory, but the vision, is at fault. How, indeed, can the conscientious artist paint life otherwise than as he sees it? Whose eyes are likely to be as useful to him as his own? The trouble with the decadents, or the pseudo-realists, is not that they deal with humanity in its darker aspects, but that they deal only with these aspects, so that the total result of the composition is quite as false to reality as the most extravagant exaggerations of the Romanticists ever were. They may paint what they see, but they do not see the whole. They would not mend matters by leaving the solid ground of observation, and endeavoring to paint what they did not see. Their only hope is in restored eyesight, and this is, I fear, a futile hope. Now when I say that the artist is bound to paint what he sees, I am not advocating a gross materialism. I do not say that it is necessarily good art to go into the haunts of vice and crime, to select the most repulsive figures which frequent those haunts, and to reproduce with microscopic exactness every loathsome feature. The phrase, art for art's sake, rightly interpreted, does not imply that. The artist must have a spiritual as well as a physical vision. To make the world and the men and women in it merely sordid and squalid is neither truth nor art, and art is before all else truth, truth in the largest and noblest sense. The vision must be the vision and the faculty divine. It must be able to discern some soul of goodness in things evil. Properly speaking, the writers of the Zola school are not realists at all. The distinctively and essentially bestial world in which their imaginations live is not the real world. They are falser, far falser, to the facts of life than Hugo or Dumas ever dreamed of being. There is more human nature as it is in Jeannie Deans than in Nana. Thackeray is a greater realist than Mr. George Moore. That is a convincing touch when Becky Sharp says that with 10,000 a year she could have been a good woman. Thackeray saw the soul of goodness in things evil. Zola sees in humanity only the muck and the slime. There is little reality in these modern studies of immorality and crime. They are as absurd in one way as the old-fashioned melodrama is in another. But they are offensive because of the artist's lack of skill, because he apprehends his subject vaguely, not because the subject itself is never to be chosen. The ability to distinguish between the false and the true in art, to paint vice as well as virtue in such a way that the moral lesson will be made obvious by the processes of art and not by the processes of argument. This ability is a question of aesthetics rather than of ethics. The moral tag is sure to be resented, the book with a purpose is sure to be dull. It is a degradation to art to say that it shall exist for the sake of philosophy or theology or sociology or economics. The artist who discards the formula of art for art's sake yields by that act the dignity of his calling. Art, as I have said, is truth in its larger aspects, life in its fuller development. and there can be no immorality in the perception of truth or the presentation of life. Immoral art is a contradiction in terms. A novel or a poem that is immoral is as bad from the aesthetic as from the ethical point of view. The artist who ignores vice and the artist who shows us nothing but vice are equal offenders against that highest form of truth which is art. Let me repeat, therefore, at the risk of being tiresome, that only in holding to this theory of art for art's sake, which Mr. Burton condemns, is the artist likely to keep his rudder true and reach the mark at which he steers. Morals and purposes are delusive lights. The novelist is an historian before all else, an historian of the life and soul of man. And when he has narrated his history with a degree of accuracy as undeviating as human conditions will permit, he has accomplished his task, and the morality of the result need not trouble him. Departure from fact is immoral, exaggeration is immoral, but not the fact itself. So long as there is vice in the world, he who takes human nature for his theme cannot ignore it. That is a poor sort of morality which consists in merely closing one's eyes. To paint evil as it is means the strongest sort of work for morality, for evil is always repulsive except when it is seen through rose-colored spectacles. This was what Shakespeare and all the great ones to whom Mr. Burton appeals certainly did. It seems to me that Mr. Burton hits upon the weak point in his own argument when he says that the so-called realists ignore two potent elements: taste and selection. True, but why does he assume that the fault lies in a defective theory, rather than in a defective vision? The decadents are right enough in believing in art for art's sake, but they are wrong in thinking that they have grasped the true significance of that theory. They are like some modern colorists who use the brush before they are expert with the pencil. They are the impressionists of literature, distorting life, not portraying it. Writers of that sort will certainly add no strength to our literature, there is no health in them. But to point to them as illustrating the fallacy of the theory of art for art's sake is not a very convincing argumentum ad hominem.